The previous chapter of History in a Half Shell ended with the immediate aftermath of Mirage Studios selling the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to Viacom. Peter Laird, one of the Turtles' co-creators, sold the franchise for $60 million, including the intellectual property and the 4Kids television series. For Nickelodeon, the acquisition was an opportunity to reconnect with boys aged 6 to 11, a demographic it had been losing to Disney XD and Cartoon Network. But given that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had always taken pride in its indie roots, many fans wondered whether the soul of the franchise had been included in the transfer of the IP to Nickelodeon. Because if the soul wasn't part of the transfer, then where did it go? Join me today as I explore the years from 2011 to 2017 in the 7th chapter of History in a Half Shell, a chapter I'm titling Under New Management. The next chapter of this story began in 1984. Not in New Hampshire, but in a town outside of Philadelphia. A 10-year-old kid named Ciro Nieli went into a comic shop and found the first issue of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Knowing how rare it was to find this book outside of New England, he knew he wasn't leaving the store without it. As it happened to many other shellheads, Ciro was fascinated by the Turtles. So much so that he spent countless hours drawing turtles behind the counter at his father's pizza place, Antonio's. This fascination with art and cartoons set him on a path to television, where he created shows like Super Robot Monkey Team Hyperforce Go, and directed and storyboarded for Teen Titans, Transformers Animated, and The Avengers: Earth's Mightiest Heroes. In 2009, after learning that Nickelodeon had acquired the Turtles, he immediately expressed his interest in the property. After one interview with the head development executive, Burke Rawlings, Ciro prepared a pitch with character designs and storyboards, which he presented to Nickelodeon shortly before Halloween. It was his vision and passion for the material that impressed the network. His pitch was about 4 turtle brothers, surrounded by weird characters, having fun in a dangerous world. But it was the simplicity of the camaraderie that got him hired as the show's producer about a month later. His take also aligned well with Nickelodeon's intentions not to remake, and to keep the franchise's integrity while adding a spin. The show was a high priority for the company, and part of a twofold strategy to re-engage the female audience in the same age range with the new Winx Club series. To appeal to younger audiences and further differentiate it from the previous animated series, Nickelodeon decided to make the show computer animated. This technological change enabled the animators to incorporate a wide range of styles suited to a variety of storytelling needs. This would then add contrast to the 2D animated flashbacks, giving the show an edgier feel. Of course, CG also added budget constraints. The show would be limited in the number of recurring characters and the cast size. This limitation would cause some characters to be dropped from episodes, sometimes even getting forgotten. Ciro worked on identifying the visual differences among the Turtles. The Turtles needed to look like teenagers, so they should look like high school athletes. Not too scrawny or skinny, but not big and hulked out either. But this would be the first time the Turtles would be noticeably different in their bodies and shapes. While the movies had experimented with this concept before, Ciro went a little further, seeking imperfections that could relate to their personalities. This also coincided with Playmates Toys' priority of giving the Turtles clear, identifiable silhouettes. Leo was the most heroic and athletic, so his body was pretty much what you'd expect from a Ninja Turtle. But he was characterized beyond this. Writers and executive producers Josh Sternin and Jennifer Ventimiglia were big Star Trek fans, so they made him have a man crush on a Captain Kirk-type character in the fictional show Space Heroes. Raphael was given a longer, tattered bandana and a stronger build. His most notorious visual characteristic was a lightning bolt-shaped crack in his plastron. Initially, Ciro thought of this crack as the result of his getting pinched in a closing grate as he fell into the sewers, explaining why he had a predisposition for pain and violence. The story behind his crack would later be given by Kevin Eastman during a last season flashback episode. Donatello evolved from a brainy character Ciro Nieli had created for an original show. As a result, Donnie was designed to be tall and lanky, with a long neck and an awkward, intellectual look. One of his most recognizable features was the gap between his front teeth. Early designs also gave him an egg-shaped head. Visually, Ciro drew inspiration from the work of the termite terrace artists behind Looney Tunes. Since Mikey was the youngest, Ciro made him shorter than his brothers and gave him an oversized shell. Inspired by the Henson Turtles, Ciro put some freckles on Mikey's face. Compared to the other turtles, he was also the one who most closely resembled the designs from the Fred Wolf cartoon. For Splinter, Ciro made him exceptionally tall to emphasize his role as the family's father figure. At 6'7", he cut an imposing figure and looked more than capable of holding his own in a fight. Ciro went through several different designs for April before settling on his original concept. Early in development, he proposed making her black, and later experimented with a blonde version. In the end, however, he returned to his first design, a redhead inspired by the Aprils of the 1990s. However, Nickelodeon wanted April to be a teenager, making this one of the biggest departures from established TMNT lore. Instead of acting as a caretaker or older ally, April needed to be someone the Turtles could relate to, a peer rather than a babysitter. The decision was also driven by a desire to broaden the show's appeal. By making April a teenage protagonist, the creative team hoped to attract more female viewers while giving younger audiences a character they could more easily identify with. For April's look, Ciro got inspired by Margot Tenenbaum from the Royal Tenenbaums. He also had no choice but to give her a ponytail because, at the time, long hair was considerably more difficult to animate in CG. The Shredder's design drew heavy inspiration from his appearance in the 1990 TMNT film, while his human identity, Orokusaki, was modeled after ninja movie legend Sho Kusugi, one of Ciro Nieli's childhood heroes. He also wore a Menpo mask, primarily to conceal the burn scars on his face. To Saki, those scars were a constant reminder of both his shame and the loss of the woman he loved. The foot soldiers were initially inspired by the Kamen Rider henchmen, but were later changed to look closer to the 1990 film and Mirage looks. Clothing was updated to more closely resemble what ninjas wore during the Shogunate period. As for Karai, the original plan was to give her long hair and a black leather outfit inspired by Death Race 2000. That design was ultimately abandoned, though elements of it would later be repurposed for Shinigami. The long hair also created technical challenges for the animation team, leading Ciro and his crew to give Karai her now iconic short hairstyle instead. To complete the look, he gave her bleached blonde hair and eyeshadow inspired by the punk aesthetic of Ladies and Gentlemen, the Fabulous Stains. In Ciro's initial pitch, the Turtles wouldn't have emerged from the sewers until after Splinter's natural death. Once on the surface, April would have filled the emotional void left by their father figure, teaching the brothers about life in New York City and introducing them to ordinary experiences like going to the movies. Each of the Turtles would have developed a crush on her for their own reasons, not just Donnie. With the show's foundation in place, Ciro began assembling a team of artists he trusted from previous projects. Ciro brought in Rodel Gravo, whom he had previously worked with on The Avengers, to help design the show's environments and overall landscape. Nadia Verbanova was responsible for painting the backgrounds and would later become the series' art director. Meanwhile, another longtime collaborator from Teen Titans, Ireneo Maramba, joined the project to assist with early storyboards and character designs. Ciro also recruited his friend and frequent collaborator, Alan Wan, as storyboard artist. Having to prioritize which environments to build first, the team centered much of the action in the East Village, drawing inspiration from its ethnic restaurants, aging apartment buildings, and distinctive New York atmosphere. Chinatown was another setting that featured prominently in many episodes, especially because it was home to the Purple Dragons. It was mostly based on Philadelphia's Chinatown, and since it was designed in 2010, the streets remained dressed as the Year of the Tiger throughout the seasons. April lived in a brownstone above her late aunt's antique shop. The store had been renamed from Second Time Around to Second Time About for legal reasons. As a final, personal touch, Ciro added his father's pizzeria, Antonio's Pizzarama, to the show's version of New York. In fact, the face featured in the restaurant's logo was based on his father himself. A big part of the TMNT identity was its origin as a comic book. Throughout the Turtlemania years, its creators made peace with the exploitation of their brand, knowing they had the real version in the comics. Shows were expensive to make, and they would eventually reboot, so there was a need for something more permanent, like the Mirage comics used to be. Nickelodeon was already looking into rebuilding the franchise using elements from the past, so whoever came in to produce the comic also needed to scratch that itch. Furthermore, the comic didn't need to be kid-friendly like the cartoon, since they knew they were producing it for an older audience. Comic book publishers like Dark Horse made their pitches, but we will focus only on IDW. Idea and Design Works is a comic book publisher founded in 1999 as a spin-off from the then recently acquired Wildstorm Productions. By 2011, the company had been home to creator-owned properties such as 30 Days of Night and Lock and Key, as well as licensed comics like Transformers, G.I. Joe, and Ghostbusters, among others. Having an open line with Nickelodeon, editor Scott Dunbier started soliciting proposals from writers on how they would relaunch Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But unfortunately, none of their pitches seemed to be striking a chord with Nickelodeon. It was then that IDW's CEO, Ted Adams, knowing that honoring the past was part of the strategy, intervened. Ted had a tendency to bring established authors who helped define the properties they had. He had already brought in Simon Furman to work on Transformers and Larry Hama on G.I. Joe. And having previously worked with Kevin Eastman, Ted decided to approach one of the Turtles' creators. It was a bit of a stretch. At the time, all they knew was that Kevin had sold his share of the property a few years earlier, so they weren't really expecting him to come back to it. To their surprise, Kevin was very interested in being part of the story-building process and wanted to be involved as much as possible. Kevin hadn't been personally involved with the Turtles since the 90s. After years of managing publishers like Tundra and Heavy Metal, he was finally ready to go back to his greatest hit. But he would need someone to co-write the book with him. It was the job of staff editor Tom Waltz to find that writer for Kevin. Tom was editing Ghostbusters at the time, but he was a key person to assign to this project because he had the passion and knowledge required for the TMNT book. Finding the right writer proved almost impossible, so CCO Chris Riel ended up asking Tom to write that book. Tom was excited to work on it, but first he needed to make a proposal to IDW and Nickelodeon. This pitch was approved in full because it combined elements from past iterations while introducing new ones. The mix made the story feel fresh, but recognizable. One big deviation from the lore was the concept of reincarnation, which would explain why the Turtles were teenagers and ninjas. Furthermore, it would provide a reasonable explanation for Splinter being both their sensei and their father. This reincarnation angle wasn't the first take. Initially, Tom considered the idea that the boys had always reincarnated as turtles over time, but Dunbier shut it down in favor of there having been ninjas in feudal Japan. Kevin fell in love with Tom's outline and signed on as co-plotter, cover artist, and, for the first arc, layout artist. Working on the book reminded Kevin of how much he loved making comics and being involved with the Turtles. This work helped him heal and relive the early days of Mirage Studios. With Tom assigned as the writer, editing chores fell on Bobby Curnow. Bobby had also grown up with the Turtles and loved them very much. In fact, this love for the Turtles was something everyone who worked on the book shared. This was probably a key to the success of what I informally call Volume 5. Kevin, Tom, and Bobby laid the groundwork in the first 12 issues that would propel the Turtles through the next 50. Artist Dan Duncan and colorist Rhonda Pattison completed the team. Tom picked Dan for the book because they had collaborated on the final issue of a comic titled Music Box. He loved his style and felt it had an indie vibe that matched the original TMNT comics. Everything was in place, but Tom was worried about how the fans would take this new volume. It was Tom's hope that by syncretizing all the earlier versions with his new ideas, he would help the fans recognize what they believed was true about their favorite franchise. By April 2011, at WonderCon, IDW and Nickelodeon announced a long-term agreement on an all-new installment of the TMNT comics, plus newly remastered collections of classic comics. The intention was to serve both new readers and older fans who were looking to reconnect with the franchise. For that purpose, IDW started collecting TMNT Volume 1 in hardcover collections and in its original black and white. Interestingly, the book debuted in a very unique month for comic books. It was the last month of the DC Universe before the New 52 reboot. DC only shipped a handful of books that month, but they were very popular issues. Amidst this chaos, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles debuted in the 48th spot in the estimated units sold, and the 33rd spot in the estimated dollars index. Pre-orders from retailers totaled an estimated 34,803 units, and the book went back for a second printing. The first year closed the initial arc of the Turtles reuniting with their lost brother, Raphael, while also introducing the reincarnation angle to the lore. It also introduced a new mutant, Alopex, designed by Kevin Eastman, and the pages of the Raphael micro-series. Another brand new character created for this arc was Old Hob. The book had a slower burn than previous incarnations, but Tom's approach successfully connected with the franchise's soul. 2012 was an interesting year for the comic book industry, filled with stretched-out events to keep readers coming back to the comic shop. In this highly competitive environment, IDW stayed afloat with an ambitious publishing plan to bring back the franchise's original fans. The black and white collections brought back issues that had been largely out of print. And while IDW still didn't have access to all the issues of Volume 1, they did have the canon story. As for the guest era of that volume, they started publishing them separately as the Classics Collection and in color. The original Archie Adventures miniseries was reprinted in a 100-page special. The special was then followed by a new collection of the Archie Adventures. And if this wasn't enough to bring back the original fans, perhaps a recolored reprint of the original comics would. IDW started publishing TMNT Color Classics, which covered the same issues that had been collected in black and white, but as single issues. While this felt like a TMNT bonanza, it's worth mentioning that the coloring in these early publications wasn't always accurate. While these comics were originally in black and white, colored versions have existed over the years, and the coloring company even redid the covers with brand new artistic decisions. As for Volume 5, issues 6 to 17 were published this year, and there were also multiple micro-series tie-ins. This volume maintained its demand more consistently than other series at the time, even though pre-orders weren't newsworthy. The book sold an estimated average of 17,000 copies per issue, when including tie-ins. The highest-selling issue this year was number 11, with 19,416 copies. This year's annual was a Kevin Eastman special, with Kevin doing the story and art. Nickelodeon wanted to celebrate the franchise's legacy in any way possible, and Kevin doing a full issue was as powerful as reprinting classic material or mixing the lore into the new volume. But despite all the new collections of the old material coming out, it was the new Volume 5 collection that proved especially successful. The first book broke into the top 10 of the collected editions, with an estimated 2,739 units. The IDW trade paperbacks would prove to have greater sustained demand than the black and white series, probably because they were being collected for the first time, and some readers prefer to buy collections rather than single issues. In different publishing news, Random House obtained Nickelodeon's master publishing license. It would be the first time since the revival years that the publishing house would have the rights to TMNT. This license was about to become useful, because there was never a TMNT show without its coloring and learning to read books. And a new show was coming. Ciro's team spent 14 months developing the show and building a 2D pilot to secure the green light. The show was produced by Nickelodeon Animation Studio and Low Bar Productions. Around 85 people were involved in production, and each episode had a 15-month cycle time from script to final timeline. About 52 sets were built for that first season, with a practical allocation of about 2 sets per episode to stay on budget. The core Burbank team handled sets, characters, planning, and some animation, while partner studios Technicolor Animation from India and Bardell Entertainment from Canada handled the remainder using Maya for animation and Nuke for compositing. The writing staff was overseen by executive producers Joshua Sternin and Jennifer Ventimiglia, who were looking for writers with nerd cred who could balance comedy and adventure within a fairly complex sci-fi fantasy 3-act structure. And on top of all that, they needed to write scripts within the technical constraints of CG animation. Fortunately, they had experience with many of them from previous projects, like Kenny Byerly, Jeremy Shipp, Jace Ricci, Ron Corsillo, and Russ Carney. Among the many influences the show had were the Ray Harryhausen classic monster movies and Japanese influences like Ultraman and Kamen Rider. This was the main inspiration for making their monsters look like a guy in a rubber suit. Casting director Sarah Noonan was brought in to assemble the actors who would bring the Turtles to life. Then, legendary voice director Andrea Romano was hired to direct them. But who would end up being the voices of the new Turtles? The most obvious choice was Greg Sipes as Michelangelo. Ciro had already worked with Greg in Teen Titans, where he voiced Beast Boy, and he pretty much designed the character thinking of him. Leonardo would be voiced by American Pie's Jason Biggs, who gave the character a young yet confident personality. Eric Bauza was brought in to voice Raphael, but after playing him over the animatics, they realized that his voice didn't contrast enough with Jason's. Eric was out, and instead, Lord of the Rings and Goonies actor Sean Astin took his place. Don't worry, Eric Bauza will return in other roles in later seasons. And speaking of Raphael, Rob Paulson, who voiced the character in the 1987 cartoon, was brought in to play Donatello. Rob was surprised to have been called, and assumed it had been a mistake, and they would eventually find out he had already played a turtle. To his surprise, this was intentional, because they wanted someone from the past who could connect with older fans and signal continuity. While the show would go on to hire actors from previous iterations, that wasn't always intentional. Such was the case for Sab Shimono, who played Lord Norinaga in the third live-action movie, and returned to play Mr. Murakami, a blind chef who would feed his specialty to the turtles, pizza gyoza. According to Saab, he wasn't hired for his legacy appeal. Since April was now a teenager, they looked for a younger actress and found Mae Whitman from Arrested Development and Scott Pilgrim. Completing the good guys was Hoon Lee, who voiced Splinter. For the bad guys, Cleveland show's Kevin Michael Richardson voiced the Shredder. X2 and Surf Ninja's Kelly Hu played Karai, and Nolan North, who you may know from pretty much everything, played the Krang. Composer Sebastian Evans came in to score the show. He, along with Stanley Martinez, also wrote the theme song, which was heavily inspired by the original Heroes in a Half Shell song and Partners in Crime's Turtle Power. The influence was so strong that Chuck Lorre and Dennis Brown are considered co-composers of the new theme song with Sebastian and Stanley. The title sequence was storyboarded by Ciro during an all-nighter. His main inspiration was the martial arts classic Sister Street Fighter, which influenced his decision to depict the Turtles using proper techniques. Ciro also created the drawings that would appear at the end of every episode throughout the series, which quickly became one of the show's most recognizable traits. According to Ciro Nieli, co-executive producer Joshua Sternin studied Japanese martial arts and organized weekly training sessions for directors and storyboard artists. The team attended seminars at Sternin's dojo and recorded extensive reference footage that informed the series' fight choreography. In fact, the show would borrow many Japanese cultural elements for the environmental design and identity of characters like Splinter and the Shredder. Continuing the franchise's legacy, Kevin Eastman was brought in as a creative consultant and advisor during the show's development and production. Kevin would later describe this show as his favorite version of the Turtles. But not everything was borrowed from the past. Yes, it had the potential to unite generations in front of the screen, but it needed to get the kids first. Sternin and Ventimiglia wanted the Turtles to have the same anxieties as regular teenagers. To them, it wasn't a stretch to compare teenagers with mutants, so they tried to tap into those universal themes. They also needed to feel like real brothers who would give each other a hard time, but would always be there for each other. In fact, for Nickelodeon, their being brothers and a family is what made it a good fit for the network. A notable change introduced in this version was that the Turtles had 3 toes instead of 2. A decision that surely still keeps some fans awake at night. New characters were also created for the show by artists such as Andy Siriano, Derek Wyatt, Jose Garibaldi, Matt Fury, and others. As the premiere date was getting closer, a lot started riding on the shoulders of the show. Nickelodeon had been losing 28% of its audience ratings to the Disney Channel and streaming over the last year in the 2 to 11 demo. This ended Nickelodeon's 16-year streak at the top of kids' programming. There was also some recent drama with DirecTV not carrying Nickelodeon, so the network needed a win. On top of all that, rumors of a Netflix effect taking viewers away from cable were trending among media analysts, but executives were cautious. By March 2012, when the fandom was negatively focused on the upcoming Michael Bay-produced movie, more on that later, Nickelodeon organized a world record-breaking event. At the Nickelodeon Universe attraction, and coinciding with the debut of the Shell Shock ride at Minnesota's Mall of America, Nickelodeon broke the record for the largest gathering of Ninja Turtles. 836 fans broke the previous record of 786 back in 2008. Nickelodeon would attempt to break this record again a couple of years later. More on that later. The show finally premiered on September 28th in primetime, with the full hour airing on September 29th in its intended Saturday morning slot. The debut was that week's top telecast with kids 2 to 11 and boys 6 to 11. Approximately 3.9 million total viewers for the week, and nearly 12 million total viewers during the premiere weekend. The premiere was successful enough to secure an order for a 26-episode second season. The first season was intentionally centered on the main characters, and the number of recurring mutant characters was kept to a minimum to let the Turtles feel more distinctive in this new animated universe. At the center of the origin story was Miwa, Hamato Yoshi's baby girl, who was raised by Roku Saki and brainwashed into thinking that Yoshi had killed her mother. The Foot Clan wasn't the Turtles' only concern. They also needed to rescue April's father from the Krang. Other existing characters adapted were Baxter Stockman, Metalhead, the Rat King, the Purple Dragons, Leatherhead, and Trag. New characters created for the show were Kirby O'Neill, Snakeweed, Spider-Bites, Chris Bradford, Fishface, Dr. Tyler Rockwell, Pigeon Pete, Justin, the Pulverizer, Spyroach, Ivan Steranko, the Neutralizer, and Krang Prime, who was voiced by Roseanne Barr. To help him with the production, Ciro brought in his best friend from college, Brandon Auman, as story editor. Brandon and Ciro shared a taste for horror that deeply influenced the show in future seasons. On average, the first season was watched by 2.8 million viewers, with the premiere being the most watched episode at 3.9 million. It looked like the lean, mean, green, incredible team was finally back for good. Despite the sale to Viacom, Playmates Toys remained the global master toy licensee for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They immediately began working on the 2012 relaunch of the line. It would be 3 long years of meticulous planning in coordination with Nickelodeon. Following the same theme of honoring the franchise's legacy, Playmates brought back staff members who defined the original line, and even hired Steve Varner and his Varner Studios, which had designed the original 1988 Turtles. But the industry wasn't the same as in 1988. Toys were now sculpted digitally in ZBrush or freeform, meaning both the toy line and the show were created on a computer. It also made for faster iterations. Unfortunately, Playmates began developing the line well before there was a finished episode of the show, which meant they could only work from scripts and partial assets, such as character turnarounds and scale references. These would be translated by toy designers into fully dimensional control drawings, which would later be handed over to the sculptor to begin creating 3D models. This also explains why that first wave of Turtles was slightly different from the final designs. Had it not been for production constraints, the Turtles and Shredder could have had double-jointed knees and ankle articulation. Nevertheless, these Turtles ended up being highly posable, especially when compared to the previous toy lines. Playmates didn't have much influence during the show's development, but one of their requests was also a must-have for the show's crew, giving each turtle its own sculpt to make them more distinguishable, ranging from 4.25 to 4.75 inches. The line started getting promoted at toy fairs and San Diego Comic-Con in 2012. A mini-comic featuring toy photography was distributed, and special editions of the Turtles with additional paint details were also sold. The line debuted nationwide at the end of July, and the first wave contained Leo, Donnie, Raph, Mikey, April, Shredder, Splinter, a Foot Soldier, and a Krang. Additional releases that year were Dog Pound, Fish Face, and Metalhead. Of course, there were other offerings, like giant figures and vehicles such as the Shell Razor, the Ninja Stealth Bike, and the Dragon Chopper. And playsets, like the Secret Sewer Lair and Anchovy Alley. They also took the opportunity to release a more classic set of Turtles, this time with colored bandanas, new sculpts, and extra articulation. It was a turnaround year for Playmates, despite the short selling window, ending as the top-selling US action figure brand and leaving empty shelves behind. They even won multiple awards and accolades from the trade. In 2013, TMNT would win the Property of the Year award, and the Shell Razor would get the Boy Toy of the Year at the Toy of the Year Awards. Early results from international markets also reported similar results. It was clear that with this much momentum and wider worldwide rollout, the Turtles were back. There was another level of engagement with the Turtles that, unlike cable, comics, or toys, was pretty much free to access, even from a library. I'm talking about browser games that were available through Nick.com. These games would range from simple concepts to almost indistinguishable from older console games. Among them were Mouser Mayhem, in which the Turtles had to jump through rooftops, fighting several waves of Mousers, Throwback, which was another fighting game where you also needed to fight a first-person Shredder by throwing foot soldiers at him, and lastly, a game titled Tales from the Turtle Lair, which acted as a prequel to the show. This barely interactive game was pretty much an episode disguised as a series of motion comics. In it, Splinter would put the Turtles through a gauntlet to test their ninja skills and force them to get out of their comfort zone. It's worth mentioning that the cast reprised their roles for these games. While there would be mobile and console games during this era, it's hard to ignore the browser games, given how many were produced and how closely they were tied to the show, often serving as a marketing strategy. As I covered in the previous episode of History in a Half Shell, a live-action movie was announced in 2009 that was considered too edgy for Paramount. A new script was then commissioned from new writers, Josh Applebaum and Andre Nemec. This is the project we now know as The Blue Door, which I also dedicated a whole video to. In addition to the initial producers, Galen Walker and Scott Mednick, 4 more producers were brought in once Paramount began negotiating a deal with production company Platinum Dunes: Andrew Form, Brad Fuller, Ian Bryce, and Michael Bay. For a while, it looked like Brett Ratner would be sitting in the director's chair, but in February 2012, Wrath of the Titans director Jonathan Liebsman was selected, and a Christmas 2013 release date was scheduled. A month later, during a presentation at Nickelodeon's upfront event for the network's partners and clients, Michael Bay pitched the film as simply Ninja Turtles. This was more than a simplification of the title. In this film, the Turtles were actually from an alien race. News spread like wildfire, and fans were outraged. Keep in mind that back then, Michael Bay was perceived as ruining everyone's childhood franchises. Hence, they had reason to underestimate the fans' reaction. But fans had a point, even if they couldn't quite articulate why. The quirky title that producers always felt allergic to was so strange, people needed to check it out. Ninja Turtles, while descriptive, didn't bring the same level of excitement. But that was just one aspect of the drama. Peter Laird, who had been very silent about the new management up until that point, expressed his concerns about making the Turtles a part of an alien race. If you've been following the history of the franchise so far, you know how much Peter hated adding more Turtles for the sake of it. He considered the idea to be unoriginal and greedy. Of course, having a whole race of Ninja Turtles out there would allow the companies exploiting the brand to create as many turtles as possible, each with their own personality. They would end up becoming green Smurfs. One could only assume that the backlash was a red flag for Paramount, as they decided to shut down production in June and push back the release date to May 2014, to coincide with the franchise's 30th anniversary. But in reality, this could give them enough time to fix the script. Remember, all of this was happening before the show's premiere. Nickelodeon had been very careful so far to honor the franchise's legacy, and losing fans over these details wasn't what they needed at the time. Only knowing about the Turtles from the cartoon and the movies, Jonathan Liebsman started talking with Kevin Eastman. This had a double purpose. One, to test ideas with someone who could truly represent the franchise's integrity. The other, for public relations. It would be much easier to put the fans' minds at ease if Kevin was involved. Although, for the skeptics out there, it looked like the director of the next TMNT film needed to call not his writers, but one of the Turtles' creators to explain the Turtles to him. Kevin was essentially doing customer support. Having said that, Kevin was only consulted and had no creative authority. Jonathan then clarified that the ooze was of alien origin, not the Turtles. And after getting exposure to the original comics, he decided to honor their hardcore nature. Michael Bay asked the fans to chill. He explained that the title had been simplified at Paramount's request, and that the script had everything that made them fans of the Turtles in the first place. It was too early to judge the movie. After all, it's not like they had read the script yet. That is, until August, when the blog TMNT, not TANT, leaked the Blue Door script. It was then revealed that the film followed the story of security guard and hockey player Casey Jones, who one day discovered 4 mysterious Ninja Turtle creatures. These turtles would eventually discover that they were the chosen warriors of an entire alien race in Dimension X, fated to return and free them from Krang and his Technodrome, which would have been the final act's threat. Japanese elements had also been replaced by American military and alien lore, with Shredder renamed Colonel Schrader. But he would have had two mutant minions, Bebop and Rocksteady. Many elements of this script would be reused for both upcoming live-action movies. Initially, given that the script was posted on a blog known for hating Michael Bay movies, there were doubts about its legitimacy. But any doubts dissipated after Paramount sent a cease and desist to the blog. Michael Bay had to go public again to explain that the leaked script predated their deal with Paramount and wasn't the working script for his movie. An additional writer was brought in to work on the final script, Evan Dougherty. After reading the script, Peter Laird expressed his relief about no longer owning the Turtles and not having to fix that mess. As for the other Turtle creator, Kevin was already in the loop for the final version of the script, which was focused on April. This was an homage to the fan-favorite 1990 film, which also had April in a prominent role. Kevin would end up providing sketches, drawings, and character designs for the movie, and most importantly, his seal of approval. The Teenage Alien Ninja Turtles debacle would end up being the biggest challenge for Nickelodeon since they took over the brand, and the earliest sign that the soul wasn't included with the purchase. IDW would have one of its best years in 2013, selling an estimated 465,000 TMNT issues overall, a 20,000 increase over the previous year. Volume 5 continued with issues 18 to 29, which included the City Fall saga, and demonstrated that, despite the similarities to previous iterations, this was a fresh and unpredictable take on the franchise. In that story, the Shredder brainwashed Leonardo into becoming his second-in-command and pitted him against his family. Leonardo would break free from this condition, and the family would escape to Northampton. However, unlike other versions, the Foot Clan found them and cut their stay short, forcing them to return to New York. City Fall became one of the highlights of this volume almost immediately, and had many repercussions throughout the years. Another subversion of the lore was the reintroduction of the vigilante known as Nobody, who, thanks to Kevin, was merged with Angel Bridge, another established character. They would take her in that direction in the following year. Other characters who transformed into others this year were Bebop, Rocksteady, and Hun. Interestingly, this idea of turning established characters into others would be very popular in the animated series as well. Apart from Volume 5, IDW published more color classics, a villains microseries, and the very iconic Secret History of the Foot Clan. Around July, they started publishing a tie-in comic for the animated series, titled The New Animated Adventures. The book would end up lasting 2 years, bringing tales of the TMNT artist Dario Brizuela back to the franchise. Sales of this comic were considerably lower than those of Volume 5, suggesting either that fewer kids were reading comics or that adults were not interested in the comic tie-in. It debuted with an estimated 14,000 copies and was selling approximately half of that by the end of the year. This reinforces the idea that comics were an effective way to keep older fans engaged, but having a book specifically targeted at kids could eventually lead to new comic readers and greater engagement with the brand. Of course, there was a bit of a constraint with this book. It was meant to take place in the same continuity as the show. This wouldn't be a problem across the pond. Nickelodeon Global Publishing signed a magazine deal with Panini to bring TMNT comics to European and Latin American markets in May that year. The new magazine would have its own non-canon comic book adventures inspired by the show, as well as puzzles and articles. The magazine would last until 2018, in collaboration with IDW writers and artists such as Eric Burnham, Landry Walker, and Jack Lawrence. These stories wouldn't get collected for the American market until 2026. Back to IDW. The publisher continued collecting stories from Mirage, Archie, and Volume 5. Kevin also brought back to print 2 books originally released through Heavy Metal, his autobiography and the 25th anniversary book, both now through IDW. In terms of sales, books had moderate sales throughout the year, but ended with a bang in December with a Kevin Eastman cover gallery book. That helped them sell an estimated 6,000 copies across all orders that month. The successful performance of the first season was the perfect cue to start optimizing the show for brand exploitation, experimentation, and course corrections. On average, the second season was watched by 2.3 million viewers, with the highest rating during the Krang Conspiracy at 2.87 million. According to Playmates, the show ranked number 1 in its premiere time period among boys' shows, and the series began expanding globally, which would ultimately boost toy sales worldwide. Behind the scenes, executive producers Sternin and Ventimiglia left the show, increasing Ciro's creative control and responsibility. To help Ciro, Brandon stepped in as the show's showrunner. Brandon and Ciro's shared passion for horror was the perfect combination for a season that needed some of those tropes. This was because Playmates requested that more mutants be introduced into the show. This sudden flood of new characters gave the show a Monster of the Week vibe. Among the new characters introduced were the Squirrelinoids, Fungus Humungus, Tiger Claw, Sir Malachi, Anton Zek, who would later be turned into Bebop, and Krang Subprime, played by Gilbert Gottfried. The team showed Kevin Eastman the new characters to see if he wanted to voice one. When Kevin found out there was going to be a character based on Clunk named Ice Cream Kitty, it reminded him of George Clooney voicing a dog in South Park, and he immediately recognized it as the perfect character for him to play. The trend of characters turning into others continued, with Baxter turning into a fly, Kirby turning into a bat, Dog Pound turning into Razar, Spike turning into Slash, and Irma being revealed as Krang Subprime. One of the characters who transformed into another was Antonio, the pizza chef, based on Ciro's father, who was reimagined as Pizza Face. This was hardly the only contribution from Ciro's past. Terflydle, Mikey's superhero persona, was based on a college roommate who used to dress like a bumblebee to mess with him. This was very likely an SNL reference, but it stuck with him because every time he would give a look at him, he would reply with a buzz buzz. So when it was Greg's turn to say the iconic phrase, Ciro asked him to do it exactly like his roommate used to do it. The reason for all these transformations, according to Brandon, were that they added a new level of engagement for the audience that brand new characters wouldn't naturally get. It also added stakes, especially after several canisters of ooze were released over the city. It added consequences to the Turtles' actions and added friction to their relationship with April. This friction was also the perfect opportunity to turn Donnie's crush on April into a love triangle. Casey Jones was introduced as a teenager, voiced by Drake and Josh's Josh Peck, and was immediately placed in the middle of that relationship. Inspired by the comic book character, this version of Casey was modeled after a young Kurt Russell, as this was how Kevin often imagined Casey. Other adaptations this year included Chrome Dome, Granitor, and the EPF. Apart from these character reintroductions and creator cameos, the show also adapted another iconic arc from the comics. Like in the 1990 movie and the 2003 show before, the team had to escape from Northampton, but this time with the added twist of the city of New York falling under the control of the Krang and the Foot Clan. Another homage to the franchise's legacy was a cameo by the 4 original voice actors from the Fred Wolf cartoon during the Manhattan Project Wormquake double episode. Another actor who returned to the franchise was Corey Feldman, who had voiced Donatello in 2 of the live-action movies and was now playing Slash. But perhaps the most notorious change in the cast was Leonardo. From the get-go, Nickelodeon made the mistake of promoting Jason Biggs on social media, not realizing that his content wasn't exactly kid-friendly. This became a constant headache for Nickelodeon, who immediately began receiving concerns from parents. Jason got reprimanded a few times before Nickelodeon decided to remove him from the show altogether. The decision caught Ciro by surprise, who didn't want to see Jason go and also didn't have a say in it. Having said that, he understood that from a management perspective, something needed to happen. The sudden disappearance of Jason had to be filled somehow, and that was the reason Dominic Catrambone stepped in to voice Leonardo for the remainder of the season and video games. But a more permanent replacement would be necessary for the following season. While the transition between Jason and Dominic might have gone unnoticed by the average kid, it marked a very clear boundary in Ciro's accumulation of creative power. When the toy line debuted in 2012, it did so late in the year, so 2013 was the first full year of the Turtles at full power. As a result of the extra months, Playmates saw a 346.3% increase in worldwide turnover compared to the year before. This increase in revenue was mainly attributed to strong sales of TMNT products throughout the year, which were helped by the show's global expansion. In fact, TMNT became the #1 action figure brand by July that year, and it was among the top 5 licenses that saw a large percentage increase in dollars during the first half of the summer. There were many significant releases this year, like Leatherhead, Snakeweed, Baxter, Rat King, Spider Bites, and another Shredder. On the classic line, they released Bebop and Rocksteady to pair with the classic Turtles from the year before. And there were also reissues from the original line, like the 4 Turtles, Shredder, Splinter, and the Party Wagon. But the money didn't stop just at Playmates. Late in October 2012, Nickelodeon made a deal with LEGO to release cartoon-inspired construction sets, vehicles, and minifigures. These were released in 2013 as part of a global rollout. It looked like it was the year of the turtle at Playmates. It started looking like the TMNT was a big brand again. So, with the comics, the show, the toys, and an upcoming live-action movie, one could only wonder if the Turtles would make a big return to the video game consoles as well. In February 2013, Nickelodeon and Activision announced a multi-year global arrangement to satisfy both old and new fans of the franchise. This meant releasing games based on the cartoon, as well as more premium titles designed for an older audience. But while fans waited for these games to come out, they had options. In the browser game category, there were some interesting releases. Among them was Donnie Saves a Princess, where Donatello imagined himself in fantasy situations, trying to save April. Another one was Heist in a Half Shell, where the Turtles had to try to get all the ingredients from a pizzeria that had been taken over by robots without being detected. And as a final curiosity, there was Mutation Station, which had little to do with the Turtles and more to do with engineering your own mutants. On mobile, Nickelodeon Interactive released Rooftop Run, a side-scrolling game published for Android and iOS in April 2013. Another mobile game that year was Mutant Rumble, published by Swaps in September. These were all games based on the show, and so far, none of them has been published by Activision. It wasn't until August that Activision released their first TMNT game, Out of the Shadows. The game was initially available for download on Xbox Live as an online 4-player brawler. It was developed by Red Fly Studio, and it was very different from other Ninja Turtles games. Our heroes were reimagined as hyper-realistic, and while the world seemed inspired by the show, the style would end up foreshadowing where the live-action movies were going. The PlayStation release was scheduled for September, but was eventually rescheduled for the following year. The game was clearly targeted at older fans, and it even featured the Turtle Power song from Partners in Crime. Unfortunately, the game wasn't well received by critics, ending on a 38 out of 100 Metacritic score. It was removed from digital stores after Activision chose not to renew the license. Finally, in October, the animated show got its first console game with the side-scrolling brawler Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. This game had a local co-op feature on the Xbox 360 and the Wii. It was developed by Magic Pockets. There was also a Nintendo 3DS release, but critics were unimpressed with any of them. The Xbox version got a 38 out of 100 Metacritic score. Most of the criticism focused on the game's repetitiveness, poor graphics, and performance issues. 2013 wasn't a good start for Activision. Their attempts to please older and younger fans didn't pan out, but at least there was an effort to deliver something a little more inspired than usual with Out of the Shadows, on the assumption that older fans would appreciate the more realistic tone. In hindsight, this should have been an early warning for Platinum Dunes. In February 2013, Michael Bay announced that Megan Fox would be the new April O'Neil. Given their rocky relationship, this came as a surprise to some, but it also rekindled fears that the movie was turning into Transformers. But for Megan, this was an upgrade from Transformers. She was going to be an integral part of a film from a franchise she fell in love with when she watched The Secret of the Ooze as a kid. She was also pregnant, which probably turned it into a challenging experience. As for the Turtles, new actors were cast for both voicing and motion capture. Pete Plawzik as Leonardo, Jeremy Howard as Donatello, Alan Ritchson as Raphael, and Noel Fisher as Michelangelo. The Turtles were animated by Industrial Light and Magic, who used all the captured data to animate their bodies and facial gestures. Their looks were also revamped for the movie, and according to Kevin Eastman, were inspired by Michael Zulli's Soul's Winter trilogy in the comics. The Turtles were now more hyper-realistic, with a mix of Japanese raiment and modern teenage fashion. The looks wouldn't be revealed until 2014. Other additions to the cast were William Fichtner as the Shredder, Will Arnett as Vernon Fenwick, Minae Noji as Karai, Whoopi Goldberg as Bernadette Thompson, and Danny Woodburn as Splinter, who was also animated through motion capture. Interestingly, some last-minute cast changes would occur much later, forcing production into reshoots and post-production magic. Just like Megan, the main actors were also fans of the franchise and would have been key to selling the movie to skeptics. Unfortunately, they weren't allowed to do press. Not that this movie was going to need it. For better or for worse, people were becoming interested in watching whatever came out of this long, complicated production. "2014 was the year the franchise turned 30, and IDW celebrated with a special issue featuring stories set in the previous comic book universes, like Mirage, Archie, and Image. Continuing this celebration, Color Classics Volume 2 reprinted the famous Mirage saga Return to New York in color, along with other issues of that era, skipping non-canon stories. The Turtles were also involved in a company-wide X-Files crossover event titled Conspiracy, where the Turtles met the Lone Gunman during a mysterious pandemic. There were also 2 tie-in miniseries with Volume 5, Outram Empire and Turtles in Time, where Raphael's future pet, Pepperoni, would be introduced. As for Volume 5, the book was slowly losing readers year over year, as is usually the case with long-running titles. Issues 30 to 41 were published this year, which could be considered the calm before the storm that would be 2015 for the book. The Mutanimals expanded with new mutants like Herman, while others like Pigeon Pete, Mondo Gecko, Nobody, Metalhead, Rat King, and the Technodrome were reimagined. The new animated adventures continued with issues 7 to 18. Demand for the book was steady, but significantly lower than that of the main book. But the Turtles weren't the only ones turning 30 this year. Ghostbusters were also having their own celebration under the custody of IDW. While their book had recently ended, its run had also begun in 2011, when Volume 5 started. The 2 books shared writers and editors, and the idea of having a crossover took a couple of years to finalize. Unlike other crossovers between 2 properties, this one was notable for having long-term repercussions in both universes, which is a story for another video. The creative team was also a mix of both books, with Eric Burnham, Dan Schoening, Luis Antonio Delgado, and Neil Uitake from the Ghostbusters side, and Tom Waltz, Charles Paul Wilson III, Corey Smith, and Rhonda Pattison from the Turtle side. Both Waltz and Burnham worked on the script, with some help from Bobby Curnow. Since the book had a very distinct style, artist Dan Schoening had to come up with a new look for the Turtles that could fit in the world. As is usually the case with Dan's art, the miniseries had a plethora of Easter eggs for both franchises. Perhaps as a way to tie in with the movies, Michael Zulli's Soul's Winter Saga was reprinted in color. Unfortunately, the recoloring didn't do justice to the originals. Overall, despite its natural attrition, Volume 5 remained the best-selling Turtle book from IDW in 2014. And the same applied to the collected books, with Volume 5 outselling any other material from Archie, Mirage, and the 2012 cartoon. Volume 5 was about to reach its 50th issue, the endgame envisioned when the series began, and these story choices would give the book and IDW their biggest year yet. The second season of the animated show ended in a cliffhanger, both in front of and behind the camera. The Turtles were forced out of New York and into April's family farmhouse in Northampton, but Leonardo also found himself without a voice. Jason Biggs' replacement accidentally started several months before his departure. During the Annie Awards, Ciro crossed paths with actor Seth Green and his wife, actress and model Claire Grant. While talking, Claire told Ciro that TMNT was one of her favorite franchises, and that Leo was her favorite turtle. After Jason was let go, Ciro immediately remembered Claire's words and called Seth, who then joined the cast. Given how different his voice was from Jason's, they used Leo's injuries during the season finale to explain the change. Another behind-the-scenes change this year was that Brandon Auman became a producer. Being big fans of horror, Ciro and Brandon couldn't help but take the opportunity to make a series of Cabin in the Woods stories, especially because they needed to make good use of the new sets. While it may feel like horror wasn't the right fit for a kids' show, it is worth mentioning that some kids do like the genre. In fact, Ciro had fond memories of watching horror with his father, whose presence eased any sort of scary moment, while also bringing them closer together. Since many kids were watching the animated series with their parents, he felt he could offer the same gift to all those families out there. This is why he named this genre family horror. Some of his childhood horror heroes, like Robert Englund and John Cassier from the Nightmare on Elm Street and Tales of the Crypt franchises, came in to voice the Dreambeavers. Bill Moseley from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 came in to voice a character named Bernie in that same episode. And much later in the season, Lance Henriksen from Aliens, who had also inspired the Archie version of Leatherhead, came in to voice the Triceraton named Zog. From a legacy perspective, they brought in Renee Jacobs, the actress who played April in the Fred Wolf series, to voice April's mom. With a horror twist, of course. Another known TMNT actor this season was Robbie Rist, who voiced the live-action Michelangelo in the 90s and was now voicing Mondo Gecko. And since he joined the Mutanimals, he was reunited with his own Donatello from those movies, Corey Feldman, who was voicing Slash. A more recent actress in the franchise, Minae Noji, who played Karai in the 2014 movie, also played Tang Shen in an episode where the Turtles traveled to the past. The family horror arc also coincided with Halloween, so it didn't stick out that much. Having said that, Nickelodeon was concerned that the horror was scarier in CG animation, and paired with a horror-inspired score, the show was starting to scare off its target audience. Fortunately, it was never the plan to stay in Northampton forever, and the Turtles returned to New York to defeat the Foot Clan and the Krang. Other new characters this season included the Creep, Bigfoot, the Finger, Speed Demon, Dr. Cluckingsworth, Chimera, the Deer, and Don Vizioso. More adaptations included Napoleon Bonafrog, voiced by Napoleon Dynamite's John Heder, the Mighty Mutanimals, Hun, voiced by Eric Bauza, Muckman, Joe Eyeball, Renette, Savanti Romero, Lord Simultaneous, Mozart, voiced by Star Trek's Michael Dorn, the Triceratons, and Bishop. The season also turned two existing characters into Bebop and Rocksteady, now voiced by J.B. Smoove and Fred Tatasciore. While the characters were already in the show before this season, it wasn't the initial plan to turn them into the famous duo. But once they saw them together, everything clicked. The news about them being introduced into the show first leaked through the action figure announcements. The show won a Daytime Creative Arts Emmy Award for Outstanding Casting for an animated series or special, a win that would be repeated in 2015. The season ended in September of the following year, with the destruction of Earth and the Turtles teaming up with the Fugitoid, voiced by Doctor Who's David Tennant, and traveling back in time to save the planet. The season was watched by an average of 1.67 million viewers, with Vision Quest being the most watched episode at 2.31 million. This was a notorious drop from Season 2, but it wasn't exclusive to this show. Nickelodeon's ratings dropped 13% in 2014, and an additional 34% during the first quarter of 2015. At the time, the shift in the audience was largely attributed to the rise of Netflix and Amazon Prime. Unfortunately, Nielsen didn't report streaming ratings at the time, so it's hard to pinpoint whether this was exactly what happened. Cable companies like Cartoon Network started making deals to include their programming on Netflix and get additional revenue from licensing, even if this lowered ratings on their channels. Having said that, the show got renewed for what could be a final season, as the creative team wasn't sure if they'd get the chance to continue past it. If you've been watching previous episodes of History in a Half Shell, then you might remember how Pizza Hut invested heavily in Turtlemania. Well, this time, they were prepared. The pizza chain started a multi-channel, summer-long promotion that depended heavily on reactivating Turtlemania nostalgia. There was even a life-size, fully functional pizza thrower at San Diego Comic-Con. They didn't use real pizzas, though. Everything looked aligned for a new wave of Turtlemania, except for the movie. After learning about the grim and gritty comics, director Jonathan Liebsman tried to honor that tone in the movie. As a result, the original cut of the film was more like a brooding action movie, targeted at an older audience. After watching the cut, producers Andrew Form and Michael Bay realized they were in big trouble, and wrote to Paramount asking for funnier writers. According to the actors, they think they filmed at least 3 different versions of the movie, each with a different tone. The final PG-13 version of this movie would be heavily inspired by the 1987 cartoon, with some elements from the IDW comics, like April naming the turtles. But there was also a surprising lack of Japanese elements. The removal of the Japanese origins became a real problem once it became evident they were whitewashing the Shredder. William Fichtner, who also provided his voice for the villain in a video game, was going to be Eric Sachs, a westernized version of Oroku Saki. They decided to split the role with Tohoru Masamune, who would be the real face of the Shredder. Unfortunately, all of this had to be resolved with reshoots and editing, and as a result, the plot suffered. Perhaps looking for more star power, Pete Plozik's voice was replaced by Johnny Knoxville, and Danny Woodburn's voice by Tony Shalhoub. The film also needed a song, which, interestingly, came from the score itself. Composer Brian Tyler, under his Mad Sonic pseudonym, remixed his own main theme and created Shell Shocked with Juicy J, Moxie Rhea, Wiz Khalifa, Kill the Noise, and Ty Dolla $ign. The visuals of the Turtles were accidentally revealed through toy photos and Halloween costume promos, immediately raising eyebrows among the fans. It wasn't until the reveal of the trailer that it had become clear that it was too late to change things. These were huge, monstrous, hyper-realistic turtles. Ironically, the curiosity around the new designs may have been the catch that the original movie's title had back in 1990. Perhaps that curiosity, mixed with the big marketing machine that now expanded to social media, were enough to turn this film into the highest-grossing movie in the franchise, even until today. Initially intended to open for the 30th anniversary of the Turtles, the movie was moved to August to give some breathing room to the latest Transformers movie. It grossed $191.2 million domestically, and a total of $485 million worldwide, against a budget of $125 million. It lasted 15 weeks in theaters, despite its 20% tomato score, 50% audience score, and its B cinema score. Critics found the movie boring, and some fans found it kinda scary. The fact that the movie was too centered on April, leaving no room for the Turtles to have character development in their own movie, was probably the biggest red flag for both groups. The film was risky. It was ultimately inspired by the 1987 animated series, but it was PG-13, and the Turtles looked nothing like they did in the Fred Wolf or Nickelodeon shows. They didn't even look like the canonical Mirage Turtles. One would have to assume that they weren't targeting either of those groups of fans. They were trying to make a whole new take for the masses. The big numbers guaranteed a sequel, and proved to the producers that they were right in changing the tone. Applebaum and Nemec were hired back to write the sequel. The success of the movie was bittersweet for the actors in the motion capture suits. They had been treated poorly on set, and they were excluded from press and promotion for the film. Alan Ritchson tried to get out of his 3-movie deal, but had no legal choice but to return. By the end of the year, Earth to Echo director Dave Green started negotiating for directing the sequel, which, at the time, was subtitled Half Shell. The film was released on DVD and Blu-ray for Christmas, making an additional $99 million. Despite the film's success, the producers decided to listen to the fans and started writing a checklist of everything they wanted to see in the sequel. They weren't gonna fall for the Toka and Razar fiasco. If fans wanted Bebop and Rocksteady, then that's what they were going to get. What they didn't know back then was how many fans were going to return. With 2014 being an anniversary year, celebrating the franchise's long history became a necessary exercise to reconnect with older fans who perhaps didn't feel the Platinum Dunes movie was for them. The Ultimate Visual History book came out this year, but there was also a documentary that had been in the making since 2009. Ironically, in the year of the highest grossing live-action film, the most heartwarming moment took place during the production of this small documentary. You may remember from the previous episode that there was a Canadian team of filmmakers consisting of Isaac Elliott Fisher, Randall Lobb, and Mark Hussey, conducting interviews with the people who'd made the franchise possible over its first 25 years. The film came to a halt when the Turtles were sold to Viacom, but in 2013, Paramount finally acquired it, with plans to release it for the anniversary. While the documentary was pretty much finished, the filmmakers wanted to film Kevin and Peter together, something that simply hadn't been possible over the past 5 years. In fact, Kevin and Peter had been in a very distant relationship since they had to compromise on the creation of Venus de Milo. But reality was a little different by 2014. Despite releasing issue number 32 of Mirage Volume 4, Peter was pretty much retired and had plenty of time to enjoy life after selling the franchise to Viacom. The two creators crossed paths during a signing at a Rochester convention. Seeing this as the perfect opportunity to get both on camera, the filmmakers followed them from the convention to Dover, New Hampshire, to visit the place where the Turtles were created. Kevin and Peter spent considerable time going down memory lane, and at one point, Peter told Kevin that it was the most time they had spent together in the past 20 years. While this was a historic moment and a turning point for the franchise, it occurred too close to the documentary's release. All they were able to do was mix the footage into the end of the movie and the end credits. While the documentary is now part of the franchise's history on its own merits, some viewers considered the term definitive in the definitive history of the TMNT a little overrated, given that most of its 1 hour and 38-minute runtime focused on the early and Turtlemania years. As a matter of fact, the filmmakers had enough material for a sequel, and taking advantage of the 2012 show being animated in Canada, they resumed production in 2016, which also gave them early access to the next iteration of the franchise. Unfortunately, after some internal changes in Nickelodeon, production stopped again, but that's a topic for a future episode. 2014 was another great year for Playmates, achieving a 30.2% increase in revenue thanks to a broadening strategy and a predictable boost from the live-action movie. That broadening was the release of Half-Shell Heroes, a line of smaller, rounded figures, vehicles, and playsets designed and safety-tested for younger hands. With this product, Playmates was trying to broaden its customer base to include 3-year-old kids. For the regular 6 to 11-year-olds, there were plenty of releases this year. Figures like Casey Jones, Mutagen Man, Neutralizer, Slash, Dojo Splinter, Tiger Claw, and variants. Bebop and Rocksteady came out, perhaps too early, as a Walmart exclusive, already spoiling what would happen in the show. Some vehicles this year included a Turtle Blimp and a new Party Wagon. For the kids who were able to watch the PG-13 live-action movie, Playmates also released a dedicated toy line featuring figures and vehicles, including the 4 Turtles, Splinter, April, Shredder, and a Foot Soldier. And for the kids in their 30s, Playmates released a remake of the movie Turtles, but not the ones they did before The Secret of the Ooze, new ones inspired by the first movie. There were also some reissues, like Krang and a Foot Soldier. For collectors, there were some new comic book Turtles that came with a recolored comic of each Turtles micro-series. And if that wasn't enough, other companies were also playing with the license. Jakks Pacific released life-size versions of the 2012 Turtles and collectible game pieces for its new Hero Portal TV video game platform. And for toy photographers, Kyoto's Revoltech line released its take on the 2012 animated series' Turtles, instantly becoming an obsession among collectors and photographers online. 2014 was truly a good year for Ninja Turtles action figures, and the peak of this period. Not all licenses are the same, and TMNT video games had an almost forgettable year. To coincide with the live-action movie, 3 tie-in games were released for different platforms. Training Lair was a free, Kinect-enabled game for Xbox 360, developed by Float Hybrid and Chrome Studios, and published by Paramount Digital Entertainment and Microsoft Studios. It received generally unfavorable reviews based on its poor responsiveness. A Nintendo 3DS game simply titled Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was developed by Magic Pockets and published by Activision. There are many curious details about this game. The only actors voicing characters from the movie were William Fichtner as the Shredder and Danny Woodburn as Splinter. Cam Clark, who had played Leonardo in the Fred Wolf cartoon, also played Leo in this game. Since the developers had to work from an early script of the movie, Shredder was still April's father, which makes one wonder how many changes the movie went through. Overall, the game received mixed reviews. The last tie-in was a mobile game initially titled TMNT that later received the subtitle Brothers Unite. It was developed by the Game Bakers and published by Viacom. Interestingly, the only actor from the movie to reprise his role was Danny Woodburn as Splinter. Cam Clark also voiced Leonardo and Rocksteady, as he used to in the original cartoon. It received mixed reviews. On the animated series side, the new release was Danger of the Ooze, developed by WayForward and published by Activision. It was a side-scrolling action-adventure video game, and most of the cast reprised their roles, with Dominic Catrimbone as Leo. It was released for Xbox, PlayStation 3, and Nintendo 3DS. While it got mixed reviews, it was an improvement from the first game. So far, it looked like the only place where TMNT games were thriving was at Nick.com. Browser games this year included a racing game titled Buggy Burnout, a highly stylized side-scroller titled Dark Horizons, where the Turtles had to deal with a mutagen leak in the sewers. It later received a less stylized sequel titled Sewer Run, Decked Out, which was a skating fighting game, another side-scroll brawler titled Foot Clan Clash, at least 2 culinary games titled Pizza Time and Skewer in the Sewer, The Final Slice, where the Turtles and April fought for the last slice of pizza, Trick or Treat Tussle, a Halloween game in which the Turtles and April discovered the Krang were distributing mutagen candy, so they needed to fight them and retrieve the dangerous sweets, and finally, Turtleportation, which was simply a series of mini-games. It's interesting how most of the games sold this year received mixed reviews, and while this behavior wasn't specific to Activision, the publisher wouldn't release another game until 2016. The internet had been around since the slow decline of Turtlemania. In the beginning, there were only a few places where fans could have conversations, which shortly spread into multiple web rings. During the following decade, the fandom started appearing everywhere, such as the Technodrome forums, Blogspot, and TMNTpedia. But perhaps the biggest breakout for the fandom was social media. YouTube in particular saw fans turn into content creators, like Michelle Ivy and her Cowabunga Corner, Pixel Dan and his toy reviews, Andre Meadows and his Black Nerd comedy, Phelan Porteous with his now famous Next Mutation reviews, and many, many more. In this never-ending paradise of opinions and fun facts, Nickelodeon also started its own channel dedicated to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in 2014. Nickelodeon used the anniversary to break its own Guinness World Record, the most people dressed as Ninja Turtles, now at 1,394 fans. They achieved this in Orlando, Florida, during the Summer of Shell event, which included character appearances and shows. But some fans would go the extra mile to repair history. This is the right time to talk about Andrew Modine. I've mentioned Andrew in previous episodes of History in a Half Shell, mostly as a writer and fan who was trying to pitch an idea for the 4th live-action movie. Andrew was particularly active on the letter pages during the Image Comics run, and after it was cancelled, he never stopped asking Peter if that volume would ever get an ending. Determined to right some wrongs, he contacted the original writer, Gary Carlson, about crowdfunding a conclusion to Volume 3. Gary offered his notes, which Andrew used not only to find a proper conclusion, but also to tie the events to the beginning of Volume 4. Interestingly, Volume 3 would receive an official conclusion much later, but that's a topic for the next episode in this series. Having liked the experience, Andrew started work on a new fanfiction novel titled TMNT Odyssey, in which he would mix many of his previous stories with the intention of giving fans of the original Mirage universe some closure. The project featured art from a few Mirage artists, and since it wouldn't be Nickelodeon approved, Andrew also included many characters that weren't part of the sale to Viacom. Getting the project into the funder's hands would be an odyssey in itself. Andrew had calculated the costs based on the Volume 3 conclusion, but that project was so successful that he received around 300 orders. He quickly realized that international shipping costs would be a problem. In fact, Andrew ended up paying the extra costs out of his own pocket, and had to receive logistical and funding help from other friendly sources. One source that made it possible was Arseny Dubikov from Russia. Arseny, who had already collaborated with Andrew in the conclusion of Volume 3, would also crowdfund the hardcover edition. By 2016, all the backers had the digital and physical copy of the novel, and Andrew started working on a follow-up novel titled Origin. But that's a story for another video. The timing of these unofficial graphic novels was crucial. They started coming out after the sudden disappearance of Mirage and its continuity. In a way, it let fans heal, and brought the Mirage artists back to the characters they loved. Mirage Comics still existed during this time, but only as a studio for its artists and to sell leftover merchandise online. So it was up to the fans to tell the stories they never got to read. No matter how many stories from that era were reprinted through IDW, the idea that the universe would not continue was still an open wound. Volume 5 made the news on its way to the 50th issue. With Shredder and Krang being too much of a threat for their world, they decided to let them battle each other, with the hope of taking one player off the board. Unfortunately, the Shredder had a contingency plan, and as a result, Bebop and Rocksteady cracked Donnie's shell open, seemingly leaving him lifeless on Harold's lab floor. This was the hook for the following arc, in which Donatello would get his consciousness transferred to Metalhead, while Harold and Honeycutt worked on repairing his body. The situation wasn't advertised, and it was a way of raising the stakes for the upcoming 50th issue. But once the cliffhanger issue got out, the book was on the news, and Donatello had been declared dead by the media. This general clout around the book allowed issue number 44 to get multiple reprints and effectively boost sales, bringing new readers to the highly anticipated conclusion of the story Tom, Kevin, and Bobby set out to write back in 2011. Unfortunately, this level of attention didn't bring everyone into the comics. Many were left with the assumption that Donatello was killed. Even to this day, non-reader fans think that the smart one was killed off in the comic. The reaction was unexpected for Tom. Characters often die in comics, and readers have learned to simply wait for their return, usually stronger than ever before. But this event caught the attention of the parents of the kids watching the show, who were now freaking out about their kid's favorite turtle getting killed off. This made Tom realize that the general population couldn't distinguish between the universes in the Turtleverse. To them, this was the same character from the show, the movie, and even the show from their childhood. This was a very different view from hardcore fans of this franchise, and it was a lesson in itself. Even though this version of the character was theirs, doing anything drastic with a turtle could unexpectedly affect other concurrent projects, such as the animated series and the toys. Having said that, Nickelodeon was right in approving the story, because by the time the Turtles had to face Bebop and Rocksteady again, the stakes were super high, and it resulted in the triumphant return of Donatello, now with a metallic shell. After 50 issues, the Shredder was finally defeated by Splinter, who then took over the Foot Clan. The creative team then began developing a roadmap for the next 50 issues, centered on a new version of the Pantheon. Some elements from Fast Forward were adapted into the comics shortly after, with characters like Darius Dunn and the Street Phantoms. But there were also new additions, like a ninja assassin named Jenica. 2 tie-in miniseries were also released this year. One was about the Mutanimals, in which new characters like Sally Pride were introduced, and others were adapted, such as Mutagen Man, Madame Null, and Man Ray. The other miniseries was an experimental April and Casey road trip story, which was IDW's attempt at the romance genre. The new animated adventures, however, were having a very different year. The book ended its run with issue number 24 and was rebooted almost immediately under the name of Amazing Adventures. The change barely gave the book a short-lived boost before sales continued to drop month after month. If anything, the move helped the creative team break free from the show's continuity, declaring it a spin-off universe from the previous comic. IDW continued collecting stories from Mirage, Archie, and their own series. The whole of Volume 2 was collected in the classic collected books, but they recolored the already colored stories with odd artistic choices. This was also the year where IDW started collecting Volume 5 and all of its tie-ins in hardcover editions, known as the IDW Collection. On a much smaller scale, IDW continued its color classic reprints, this time collecting City at War. So far, while Volume 5 had a significant boost thanks to Donatello's near-death experience, IDW wasn't really having a great year with the Turtle books. That is, until December. According to Kevin Eastman, they began exploring the possibility of a crossover miniseries with DC Comics. And since he was a huge Jack Kirby fan, he pitched a team-up between the Turtles and Kamandi, the last boy on Earth. DC was apparently intrigued by the choice, and they suggested Batman instead. Kevin didn't know Batman was on the table. Unlike the Ghostbusters crossover, this new miniseries couldn't be canon, because, at the time, James Gordon was Batman, and Splinter was leading the Foot Clan. It would have simply been too confusing for casual readers. The first issue was released in December and ranked number 3, with an estimated 134,000 copies sold. That same month, Volume 5 had sold an estimated 17,000 copies. The power of Batman was strong, and the book became a bestseller for DC month after month. Thanks to Batman, the Turtles started a streak of great years at the comic shop, both in single issues and in collected editions. The 4th season of the animated series started with a long batch of sci-fi episodes inspired by The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Unlike the Monster of the Week format of the 3rd season, the show relied on a Planet of the Week template. This made it one of the hardest seasons to make, as it required even more assets and locations than previous seasons, and greater continuity control. The main explanation for the interstellar adventure was to stop the Triceratons from finding all the hidden pieces of the black hole generator, stop the destruction of their planet, and save Master Splinter. While that was the overall arc, the first part of the season probably felt slower than it needed to. This minimal progress was due to the restrictions imposed by Nickelodeon. They couldn't guarantee that multi-part episodes would be broadcast in order, so they preferred to avoid that much continuity. This was already a stretch for the network, as they were used to splitting their shows into 11-minute stories. Nickelodeon also suggested adding a 5th turtle with superpowers to the team, something that the creative team managed to avoid, introducing Choppy instead to replace the now mutated Spike. If dealing with Nickelodeon wasn't pressure enough, Ciro also had to contend with Playmates suggestions, who asked for the Space Turtles to adopt a metallic suit to release a vacuum metallized version of them. Ciro shot down the idea because it would have made them too shiny and too visually noisy. A standout episode during the first half of the season was Transdimensional Turtles, which reunited the original cast for a crossover with the new Turtles. This meant that Cam Clark, Townsend Coleman, Barry Gordon, and Pat Fraley returned to voice Leo, Mikey, Donnie, and Krang, alongside Rob Paulson, who was voicing the 1987 Raph and 2012 Donnie. Unfortunately, James Avery, who voiced the Shredder in the original series, passed away, so the character wasn't included. The story assumed that Krang already had his adventure in Turtles Forever, as he's already aware of the domino effect of destroying the original Turtles. It also changed continuity by making him part of the Krang and a cousin of Krang Subprime. While Transdimensional Turtles was more accurate in its depiction of the 1987 Turtles, the episode received some criticism for its very basic 2D animated segments. The Turtles saved their planet, of course, and the show went into a long break from April to August 2016. Because of that break, this season started in 2015 and ended in 2017. The second half of the season revolved around the Super Shredder and his final confrontation with the Turtles. Artist Sheldon Vella storyboarded one of the season's most poignant moments, Splinter's death. This was the moment the series achieved its climax, with the Turtles finally deciding to put an end to the Shredder for good. The Shredder's death sequence was initially storyboarded by Adam Lucas, but director Rie Koga had to redraw it several times until the network approved it. These were very serious episodes for a kids show, and could easily be considered the conclusion of the story if the show didn't get renewed for an additional season. The season introduced new characters like Sal Commander and Shinigami. It also adapted classics like Lord Dreg, Mona Lisa, voiced by Zelda Williams, Worm, Armageddon, voiced by Ron Perlman, Belly Bomb, the Utrams, now as a separate tribe from the Krang, Toka, Anthrax, Scumbug, Wingnut, Screwloose, Alopex, and more. There was also a Half-Shell Heroes 2D animation special that performed very much in line with the show, with 1.41 million viewers. This special had the same actors from the show reprising their roles for a younger audience, and while it was successful, it didn't have any sequels. The season averaged 1.43 million viewers per episode, with the most watched episode, The Evil of Dreg, drawing 1.7 million. Nickelodeon had already started pre-production on a new TMNT series, but because of the timing, this would have meant no more Turtles until late 2018, allowing Ciro and his team to fill the programming with at least one last season. Formidable competition and the lack of a feature film were enough to decrease Playmates' revenue by 28% compared to 2014. This started a downtrend that would last until 2021, and it took even longer, until 2023, to finally have a Turtles-related boost. Despite the competition in the action-adventure genre, Playmates continued to rank among the top-selling boys' action toy brands in the US and key international markets. New figures this year included Dark Beaver, Karai Serpent, Turflydle, Stockman Fly, Attila the Frog, Monkey Brains, Napoleon Bonafrog, the Fugitoid, Mondo Gecko, and Lord Drag. There were variants, like the Mystic and Dimension X Turtles, and a redo of the Head Droppin' Turtles. In the vehicles and playsets area, they released Casey's Slamboni that came with an unmasked Casey figure, the Fugitoid ship, and a Sewer Lair reissue with a new Dimension X portal. Other releases this year included an expansion of Half-Shell Heroes and the history of the TMNT featuring Leonardo, which included 8 versions of the character, from Mirage to the 2014 movie. This was also the year when NECA started playing with the 1987 version of the Turtles, releasing Body Knockers. This would foreshadow a year of intense competition for Playmates. This time, not against other action-adventure franchises, but the Turtles themselves. After an unsatisfying 2014, Activision skipped 2015 altogether, leaving room for other companies to release their own take on the license. But then, very little happened. There was also another mobile puzzle game titled Battle Match, developed by Tiny Castle Studios. The rest of the games this year were available through Nick.com. Browser games like Battle for New York, which was another collection of mini-games featuring the Turtles and the Mutanimals, Build and Battle, where you could build the Shellraiser or the Party Wagon and use it to battle on the streets, Collect and Conquer, where the Turtles had to go through different locations collecting objects, Comic Book Combat, where the Turtles had to fight the clan through some editable mazes divided by comic book panels, Mikey's Day Off, which was just another collection of minigames, Pizza Like a Turtle Do, which was yet another pizza-making game, Shadow Heroes, where the Turtles had to fight their enemies without being seen or heard, otherwise Ho-Chan and his ghostly minions would come for them, and finally there's Speed Demon, which was basically an obstacle race game. To top it all off, Half-Shell Heroes also had a browser game based on the Blast to the Past special. One would expect that, after this uneventful year, Activision would return with a winning strategy, but they would instead end up marking the end of another era in TMNT games. Volume 5 continued its long-term storytelling with the focus on the Pantheon, Agent Bishop, Leatherhead, and Splinter as the leader of the Foot Clan. And while the book remained stable in sales, it was starting to lose steam again. But not as much as Amazing Adventures, which ended with issue 14. The book had a special with NBA star Carmelo Anthony, who was heavily involved with the franchise this year. In that story, Mello was temporarily mutated into an armadillo and was nicknamed the Carmadello. He was part of a partnership between Macy's and Nickelodeon with a brand titled TMNT x Mello that included apparel and sports goods. Mello also had a cameo in the 2016 live-action movie. While the comic ended, it continued in the shape of a miniseries. The first one was a Batman and TMNT animated adventures. DC and IDW had recently finished their Batman TMNT miniseries, but this wasn't a sequel to that story. Instead, this was a crossover between the animated shows for both properties. The book, published by IDW, debuted at number 14 in the Units Index, but quickly lost steam month to month, still selling more than Volume 5 and Amazing Adventures. Batman was such a big sales push this year. Comics with the Caped Crusader sold more than twice what the Turtles alone could. Probably tempted by the success of Batman and TMNT, IDW decided to expand the universe, trying their luck with a spin-off title of Volume 5 with a brand new number 1, and covers by Freddie E. Williams II, the same artist from the Batman miniseries. One could assume that the idea was to bring in the new readers from the Batman book. TMNT Universe ranked number 85 in the Units Index on its debut, selling 100% more than Volume 5 that month. Unfortunately, the book quickly dropped to Volume 5 numbers in its third month, and continued losing readers month after month, underperforming compared to the main title. While the book was an excuse to focus on the extended world of the Turtles and bring in artists who would normally not have a chance in the regular title, it was an anthology series, and therefore couldn't keep everybody happy. Loyal fans would buy it, but for the rest, once a story was finished, readers might decide not to return for a new story and team. A special this year included Deviations, which explored what would have happened if the Turtles had joined the Shredder during City Fall. And perhaps the wildest miniseries of 2016, Bebop and Rocksteady Destroy Everything, which came out weekly. Batman also dominated collected book sales this year, outperforming releases from IDW, Archie, and Mirage continuities. Overall, 2016 was a year of experimentation and risk-taking for IDW, but in the end, it would be thanks to the stability of Volume 5 that the publisher would break a new record the following year, the longest-running TMNT comic series. As successful as the 2014 movie was, it still disappointed fans looking for icons like Bebop, Rocksteady, and Krang. Producers and writers then included these characters in the sequel, and even added more characters and plot points from the Blue Door script. The cast returned as per their contract obligations, but at least this time around, they found some changes in production. When asked what the main difference between Liebsman and Green as director was, they replied, kindness. And it was a real upgrade for them too. This time, they were able to do a little more press, and without Johnny Knoxville, Pete Plawsick was allowed to voice his character. Many cast members were replaced for the sequel. Brian T. as the Shredder, Peter D. Badalamenti as Splinter's motion capture actor, Tyler Perry as Baxter, and Brittany Ishibashi as Karai. New additions were Arrow's Stephen Amell as Casey Jones, Brad Garrett as Krang, Laura Linney as Police Chief Rebecca Vincent, Gary Anthony Williams as Anton Bebop Zek, and Stephen Seamus Forelli as Owen Rocksteady Rocksteed. Megan Fox, Will Arnett, and Tony Shalhoub reprised their roles, and there were also many cameos from NBA stars like Carmelo Anthony and Kevin Eastman as a pizza delivery guy named Kevin. Other remarkable cast choices were Fred Armisen, who almost voiced Krang, and Judith Hoag, who once played April O'Neil in the 1990 movie, and had a short scene as Megan Fox's boss that, unfortunately, had to be cut from the film. After seeing how good a job Industrial Light and Magic did in the climax of the first movie, the producers decided to put the Turtles in more daylight scenes, bringing down the darkness overall. They also made the movie more family-friendly with little adjustments, like replacing all the guns from the Foot Clan with swords. The score was composed by Steve Jablonsky, and the soundtrack included a cover of the classic 1987 theme song by Mexican boy band CD9. Coinciding with the film, NYC and Company, New York City's official destination marketing organization, and Nickelodeon announced the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as the newest NYC family ambassadors. This was part of a marketing campaign to highlight New York City as a family-friendly destination. This would be an honor that the Turtles would repeat the following year. The movie, now titled Out of the Shadows, was released on June 3rd and grossed $35 million in its opening weekend. That was $30 million less than the 2014 movie's opening. The film would end up grossing $82 million domestically and $246 million worldwide. Given its $135 million budget, it's very likely the movie didn't break even, not even after the home release, which added $25 million more. For DVD and Blu-ray, this was also a 75% drop from the first movie. Overall, the movie ended up being the third most grossing film in the franchise at the time, even after adjusting for inflation, but also the most expensive one. The box office disappointment was enough to cancel a third film. It wouldn't be until 2021 that Colin and Casey Jost would get attached to write a new live-action movie from the same producers, which ultimately went nowhere. So, how did this new movie franchise go from its biggest film to its greatest disappointment? Let's unwrap that, because I feel like this is a case worth studying. After looking at the numbers, I actually believe that the movie was very successful in finding its real audience, but was budgeted incorrectly. It wasn't word of mouth, because pre-sales for the movie were already tracking much lower than the first movie, which meant that the franchise had lost most of its target audience between installments, adding to the confusion of the film's producers who couldn't figure out why the fans weren't coming back for Bebop and Rocksteady. I already hinted at this, but I believe the first movie was the wild card. The new designs intrigued casual viewers, but the nostalgic appeal wasn't strong enough, especially given that not even the Turtles' silhouettes looked familiar. Whoever was left that found hyper-realistic parkour mutant turtles that hung out with Megan Fox as their version of the half-shell heroes returned for the sequel. I think the upgrade to an A- cinema score also supports the theory that the movie actually found its audience. It just happened to be much more niche than the first one. It even had a 38% score on Rotten Tomatoes, which was also an improvement. The audience had really niched down. There was little overlap with the animated series, the comics, or the video games. In fact, the movie had no video games, as the 2013 Out of the Shadows game was unrelated. Looking at historical data, the movie actually performed predictably. Adjusted for inflation, The Secret of the Ooze, a movie with a much smaller budget, also opened with $35 million. But it also dropped a healthy 35% on its second weekend, compared to Out of the Shadows' 56%. The change in revenue was more gradual for the original trilogy, and New Line adjusted the budget accordingly for the third film. Since the 2014 movie opened so high, the surprise was much more unpleasant. Perhaps the biggest mistake this time around was assuming that this was a predictable franchise. Each new iteration of the Turtles performed differently, and this wasn't the 1987, 2003, or 2012 Turtles. This was a new take, featuring bulletproof superhero turtles. It was never going to reach the same audience, which meant the 2014 movie was an even bigger risk than they had imagined. They created a new version of the franchise, and once the smoke of curiosity dissipated, all that was left was the real target audience. The 2007 movie, with a $34 million budget and a $95 million gross, should have been the model to follow. That movie didn't attempt to become a 4-quadrant blockbuster, and was budgeted accordingly. Clearly, producer Tom Gray and Mirage knew a thing or two about the market for new takes on the TMNT. Had that movie received a sequel, it would have had an even smaller budget, learning from the mistakes of The Secret of the Ooze. It's no surprise that the two highest-grossing TMNT movies were the 1990 and 2014 films. Listening to the producers talk about this franchise felt like they were assembling a Turtles movie by adding the ingredients fans wanted to see. A strange, reactive behavior from a franchise once known for its originality. The sequel felt like it was assembled in a factory, and someone forgot to put the soul in. Unlike Ciro's show or Tom Waltz's comic universe, projects that felt like they could only have come from those specific people, Out of the Shadows was TMNT a la carte. Playmates 2016 ended with a 36% decrease in revenue compared to the previous year. The reason behind the drop was said to be mostly strong competition. The action figure category in the US also experienced a slight decline overall, attributed to the underperformance of some movies. In this unstable scenario, Playmates acquired the global license for Ben 10, 2 years after its last season. The show was about to be rebooted and targeted at a new generation of kids, a move that proved successful the following year. Interestingly, this would be the path TMNT would eventually take as well. Apart from Ben 10, Playmates acquired the rights to Voltron. Among the action figures based on the 2012 animated series this year were Dimension X April and Casey, Dire Beaver, Armageddon, Karai, and the Super Shredder. Vehicles included the Grass Kicker and a green version of the Shellraiser. A first wave of Ninja Superstars WWE was released, featuring turtle reimagined versions of WWE stars like Sting, John Cena, Undertaker, and Randy Savage. And, as is already a tradition at the late stage of each line, there were also Micro-Mutants. For the Classics line, Playmates released a wave of 1991-inspired figures, as well as some reissues of the original line. Despite the live-action movie's underperformance, Playmates released action figures including the Turtles, Casey with and without his mask, Shredder, Bebop, Rocksteady, Krang, and more. This time, there were also playsets, like the City Sewer Lair and the Technodrome, plus vehicles like the Turtle Tactical Truck. The toys still gave the brand a boost, allowing Playmates to perform better in US retail, with TMNT ranking among the top-selling boys' action toy brands. Construction Toys also held on to the license this year, with Megablocks and Magformers releasing sets, vehicles, and figures in 2016. On the collector side, companies like Loyal Subjects, WizKids, and Mondo also released their own takes on the heroes in a half shell, starting a trend that would bring the Turtles to kids of all ages, especially those over 30. NECA had several significant San Diego Comic-Con exclusives this year. On the arcade nostalgia side, there was a Shredder and Foot Clan 4-pack and an Arcade Turtles 4-pack, both of which came with their own arcade-inspired packaging. Continuing with the line they started in 2008, they also released a Mirage 4-pack that included the Shredder, an Elite Foot Ninja, and 2 Foot Soldiers. But they didn't stop there. They also released a 5-foot-tall Leonardo in the style of the Fred Wolf cartoon and quarter-scale versions of the 1990 movie Turtles. These 2 releases would be a small taste of what the company would release in subsequent years, pretty much dominating the TMNT action figure collector scene. The Fred Wolf Turtles in particular became popular again, probably because Playmates was releasing the 2012 line. Bandai released super articulated figures based on the 1987 series. More 2003-inspired, Dreamy X released a series of 1/6 scale Turtles, Casey, Shredder, Krang, and eventually April. The Turtles were expanding to meet the demand of kids and former kids of Turtlemania. And just in time, as Playmates was about to reduce their output. Mutants in Manhattan was a game developed by Platinum Games and released by Activision on May 24, 2016, for Xbox 360, Xbox One, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, and Windows. This wasn't an animated series tie-in. Instead, it was its own universe, inspired by the IDW comics. It featured a script by Tom Waltz and a style heavily inspired by Mateus Santaluco's artwork from the comics. The game received generally unfavorable reviews, and currently holds a 44 Metascore, largely due to repetitive gameplay and a chaotic combat system. Unfortunately, by January of 2017, the game would disappear from the digital stores, as Activision's TMNT license expired and wasn't renewed. And that was the last game of the Activision era. The 2016 live-action movie didn't get a tie-in game, possibly because of how poorly tie-in games were perceived, or perhaps because they had already developed a game titled Out of the Shadows. Looking back, the games released during their tenure were not well received by audiences, so it was clearly time for a change, especially with the current animated series ending. The 2016 Turtles did get their place under the spotlight inside another TMNT mobile game titled Legends. This turn-based game, developed by Ludia Inc., was published in May 2016. It was mostly based on the 2012 animated series, but eventually started including characters from the 1987, Mirage, and 2014 universes. Coinciding with the movie, the game included a special temporary quest based on it, but eventually became a permanent play mode. The game was highly addictive thanks to its character collecting feature, but it also had microtransactions and a subscription to accelerate progress. Another mobile game this year was Portal Power, developed by Red Fly Studio and published by Nickelodeon Interactive. It was a beat-em-up game where the Turtles traveled through portals, trying to take down Shredder and the Krang. It would later be ported for PC. And finally, a Half-Shell Heroes mobile collection of minigames published by Nickelodeon. On Nick.com, some of the browser games were direct tie-ins with the show. For example, Kickin' It Old School was launched to coincide with the Trans-Dimensional Turtles episode, and it featured all classic cartoon turtles, loosely following the plot of that story. Other notable browser games included Casey Jones vs. Evil Robot Ninjas, where Casey would use his pucks to defeat the Foot Clan, Deep Space April, which followed April through her adventures against the Triceratons and other creatures in space, Mech, which was a fighting game pitting the Turtle Mech against Krang Prime, Mega Mutant Battle, which was a turn-based fighting game, Ninja Hack Attack, a puzzle game in which the Turtles had to break into TCRI, Turtles in Space, where the Fugitoid would send the Turtles on many missions, and finally, Ultimate Hero Clash, which was a tournament game pitting the Turtles and April against the Power Rangers. It's interesting how this year marked the end of multi-year contracts for the franchise. While the games released by Activision weren't well received, they also had plenty of competition from free mobile and browser games. And since the show was already computer animated, it wasn't hard for many of these games to look exactly like the show. With issue number 73, TMNT Volume 5 became the longest-running TMNT comic, surpassing Archie's 72 issues. 2017 was a year of month-long miniseries and crossovers with other properties, from the TMNT and Batman Adventures, the beginning of the second Batman TMNT miniseries, a second Ghostbusters miniseries, and a TMNT and Usagi Yojimbo special. Perhaps to give the animated universe some breathing room until the next iteration of the Turtles in 2018, the Robotanimals miniseries was the final 2012 spin-off. A Dimension X miniseries followed the Turtles through different planets during the Trial of Krang story arc, a saga that ended with the villain's apparent demise. Just like with the first Ghostbusters miniseries, both the sequel and the Usagi Yojimbo special were canon. Usagi's case was even more interesting, as Miyamoto still remembered meeting the Mirage version of the Turtles, making him a constant across the comic book Turtleverse. Volume 5 focused on the rising threat of Agent Bishop and the EPF, the latent menace of the Pantheon, the trial of Krang, and the Triceraton invasion of their original planet, Earth. TMNT Universe expanded on plots that the main title had no time to develop, like Metalhead turning evil, expanding the lore of the Pantheon, Karai's newfound purpose in life, and the settlement of the Triceratons on Earth. Despite this clearly being a companion book to Volume 5, it sold considerably fewer copies per month, In collected editions, Batman continued to be the best seller, this time with a softcover edition of the first miniseries and a collection of the Batman TMNT adventures. After 77 issues, Tom and Kevin's run was starting to lose some steam, and it was starting to become clear that the upcoming 100th issue would be the perfect opportunity to start a brand new chapter with a new status quo. Perhaps a little too late in the game, Raw Thrills launched an arcade game based on the 2012 animated series, coinciding with the very last episode of the show. Clearly inspired by one of the Turtles' more successful games, this new 4-player brawler used the same 3D models from the show, and like most of the other games of this era, featured the voices from the cast. This game would later be ported to consoles with expanded levels under the name of Wrath of the Mutants. A mobile game built on Unreal Engine 3, developed by FL Mobile, was released exclusively in China, titled Ninja Turtles OL. It was built around the style of the 2012 show, but adapted to the Chinese market. 2017 wasn't short of browser games, like Extreme Skate 5000, which was a racing game based on the fictional tournament run by Fishface. Another game was Laser Cave, where the Turtles had to fight some drones, or Monsters vs. Mutants, which was based on the penultimate arc of the series and had the Turtles fighting against iconic monsters. There was also Pizza Quest, which was an impressively entertaining turn-based fighting game where the Turtles also made pizzas for their allies, like Splinter, April, Casey, Karai, Fugitoid, Shinigami, Metalhead, Mona Lisa, Slash, and Mondo. There was also Trivia, a game with questions about the first arc of the 5th season. Terflydal Quest 3D was a game where Mikey, in his superhero persona, would go on missions, flying through the city. There was also a crossover game this year titled Ultimate Hero Clash 2, which was a sequel to the first TMNT and Power Rangers tournament game. Finally, in 2018, a Totally Turtles browser game came with the Turtles from 1984, 1987, 1993, and 2014, though notably they were all based on the 2012 version. It's hard to evaluate the 2011 to 2017 period when it comes to video games. For the most part, it felt like there was potential for some memorable games, but at least to me, it was the cheapest games that felt the most addictive and enjoyable. As a final note on the topic, in 2017, Guinness declared TMNT the most prolific superhero team in video games, with 38 releases, not counting handhelds, LCD, browser, and fan-made games. Otherwise, the number would be around 100. Playmates ended 2017 with a year-to-year decrease of 24% in revenue. But this time, it was expected. Playmates started limiting shipments of current TMNT products in late 2017 to allow for a fresh start for the upcoming Nickelodeon show. This caused an overall contraction of the license, and as a result, many previously announced figures were cancelled. Some action figures released this year were Crimson Leader Tiger Claw, Samurai Turtles, Usagi Yojimbo, Muckman, and Monsters plus Mutants. Playmates also experimented with repaints this year, which was something the company had historically avoided, perhaps in an effort to reissue action figures that weren't that old. Examples of these repaints were Shredder, Razar, Leatherhead, Mutagen Man, and Stockman Fly, among others. Playmates also had some crossovers this year, with a second wave of WWE champions like Ultimate Warrior, Finn Balor, Roddy Piper, and The Rock. There were also some Ninja Ghostbusters, with Donnie as Egon, Leo as Ray, Mikey as Peter, and Raph as Winston. 2017 was also the year that NECA released their first set of the 1987 Turtles in a special collector case for San Diego Comic-Con. It would be the beginning of a long and healthy line. When looking back at this era of Playmates, I think it's impressive how much output they had, especially during times where other companies were competing for the older kids. But I also can't help but think of some lost opportunities. The charm of the original was in how unique it used to be. Back then, Playmates spent time and effort in creating brand new sculpts and characters that not always had to look or even appear in other media. Since the release of the next mutation, Playmates had been playing it safe, always working on existing characters from the shows. The fact that they brought back toy designers and sculptors from that era, but continued adapting characters from the cartoon, felt like a lost opportunity to make kids' imaginations run wild. The kind of crazy toys that one day would inspire those kids to adapt them into TMNT stories, just as every creative team behind the shows and movies since has been doing. Here's the deal. Even if the writers hadn't closed most of the plots by the 4th season, the show was aimed at kids aged 6 to 11. A 6-year run would cover a generation that was 6 when the show started. Nickelodeon already knew it needed a show for the next generation, and given the success of the current show, it asked Ciro if he wanted to get involved. A new show was going to happen anyway, so if he wanted to continue working with the Turtles, this was his opportunity. But Ciro simply couldn't bring himself to do it. He put too much personal stuff in the DNA of the 2012 series. Personal stories, earmarks from his childhood, even his father was a villain in it. The idea of wiping out that version and starting over felt wrong. Furthermore, he also couldn't imagine a different cast voicing the Turtles, as they were his definitive version of them. With Ciro out of the picture, Brandon Auman was tapped to lead the next iteration of the Turtles, but after writing his pitch, he decided to move on to write and produce Star Wars Resistance. Nickelodeon continued looking for talent within the show to lead the development of the next one, but there was still a final season to produce. The team decided to shake things up and finally tell the stories they wanted to tell. And why not? Even create a backdoor for future content in this universe. Ciro believed that making an anthology season with standalone arcs could prove to Nickelodeon that they could release a few straight-to-video movies per year, like Warner Brothers was doing. Unfortunately, this never came to pass. The season was rebranded Tales of the TMNT, and the intro was changed to feel more age-appropriate for those kids who were 6 when the show began. Each arc had its own art direction, and they even brought in the creators of the characters they used, like Kevin Eastman and Stan Sakai, who wrote stories about Splinter and Miyamoto Usagi, respectively. Given that only 20 episodes were approved, some pitches were never produced. Among them could have been a story introducing the Flaming Carrot, and a 2-part story bringing back the Dream Beavers. News of the title change leaked during the Toy Fair that February, and it wasn't until March that the fate of the show was revealed. Rise of the TMNT was announced for 2018, and Tales was officially the last season of the current iteration. Tales adapted characters like Hothead, voiced by Mark Hamill, Hattori Tatsu, Miyamoto Usagi, Verminator, and played around with the concept of the Turtles as the universal monsters. Unfortunately, the show had some hiccups in its final batch of episodes. The main problem seemed to be a disagreement over what the show's ending should be. Ciro had planned a 90-minute arc about a mutant post-apocalyptic world that would take place in the future as a safeguard so that no one could change the ending of that universe. The story had a mix of influences, from Commandi to Mad Max to the Palladium RPGs. He also made sure the story ended with a new beginning, just in case they could one day return to continue it. But Nickelodeon sent this and the Monsters and Mutants arcs to Nicktoons, and declared the Mutant Wasteland story non-canon. This then elevated the last arc to be aired into the new series finale. That arc was another crossover with the Fred Wolf Turtles, this time with Kevin Michael Richardson voicing the 1987 Shredder. The quality problems viewers had with Transdimensional Turtles were resolved for Wanted, Bebop and Rocksteady, even if the 1987 Turtles were again depicted as less capable, making the 2012 Turtles look cooler. And with that arc, the show ended on a bittersweet note. It was a good ending, but not the one Ciro intended. Interestingly, this wasn't the most watched episode. That honor went to End Times, with 1.14 million viewers. Overall, the season averaged 1 million viewers per episode, except for episodes aired on Nicktoons, as ratings weren't measured on that channel. Ciro would end up writing a book compiling all the work that went into the show that was titled The Art of TMNT. The book was published by Dark Horse in 2019, and it's currently out of print. If you want to see how much passion and creativity went into this show, I highly recommend finding a copy and even asking Dark Horse to bring it back to print. I started this video wondering whether the soul of the franchise was something Nickelodeon could buy, largely because of the Turtles' indie origins and how they always stood out as an underground property. Then again, this wasn't the first time that the franchise went through a period of exploitation. There's a recurring pattern in popular culture known as the commercialization of subcultures. It always starts with an emerging cultural movement that makes a breakthrough, and then corporations exploit it until it loses what made it special. Usually, a subset of the audience rejects the new reality and tries to defend the original values. The Turtles already went through this cycle during Turtle Mania, but they ended up returning to their roots under the curated management of Peter Laird and Gary Richardson, people who had an unconditional love for the franchise. But would Nickelodeon have the same restraint? And when the machine inevitably ran out of steam, what would bring the franchise back to its roots? Well, it turned out the soul wasn't part of the IP, but it was present all along, because it was replicated. The soul was simply love for the franchise. It happened in 1984, when a very young Ciro went into a comic shop and found the first issue of TMNT. It happened again when Tom Waltz got hooked on the complex storytelling of the 2003 cartoon. It happened when fans of the source material became artists to one day work with the franchise, or even do a fan fiction finale for a cancelled series. When this love for the franchise gets involved in the creative process, the results are noticeably more authentic. Unlike the production of the second movie, which seemed driven by a checklist, the 2012 animated series and the IDW comics were born of the feelings and memories the franchise had already left in those creators. Working on the comics finally allowed Kevin to return to his love of comics and the Turtles. That replication from them to Ciro in 1984 eventually came back to Kevin, who still considers the 2012 animated series the best adaptation in the franchise. The love for this franchise is always replicating, inspiring new generations of kids who will later become involved with inspiring another generation. This is what happened with Ciro. He found that love when he was 10 years old. It inspired him for 25 years, and thanks to him, that love was replicated in the hearts of a whole new generation of kids. That's why the Turtles, despite their ups and downs, always come back. Not because of a marketing campaign, but because of the impact it left on its fans. In the end, it turned out that the Turtles' soul was under new management all along, just not with Paramount. As I mentioned earlier, Brandon Auman worked on a Bible for a new show titled Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Since making the new show as different as possible from the 2012 series was the main requirement, Brandon set the story slightly earlier in the timeline than usual, and placed Raph as the leader of the group. He came up with some ideas for mystical portals throughout New York that could allow the Turtles to travel to other dimensions, and there would also be a mystical underground place called the Hidden City. And in this version, the Shredder would have been an ancient villain. The new show would also be in traditional 2D animation, and in classic Nickelodeon fashion, episodes would be split into two 11-minute stories. Allegedly, the latter was the breaking point for Brandon. He didn't like the 11-minute format, and he also didn't feel like he could top what he had done for the 2012 animated series. He moved on to Star Wars, leaving a vacancy in his place. Nickelodeon then approached Ant Ward, a supervising producer on the 2012 series, and Andy Siriano, a freelance artist and writer from shows like Plastic Man and Samurai Jack, to pitch their ideas, which turned out to be almost the same. The duo would end up creating perhaps the franchise's first true cult classic. But I'll cover all of that in the next episode of History in a Half Shell, which will be centered on the reinvention of the Turtles. It's been a long video, so if you're still around, leave a comment below, starting with a booyakasha and what your thoughts and memories of this era are. Thanks for watching. See you in the sewers.